Hello, I'm Michael from Holy Spirit Activism, and here are 7 reasons why Christians, or anyone really, shouldn't wear expensive clothing. Number 1, they're boastful. Admit it, they're always boastful. The only reason that you buy expensive clothes instead of cheap clothes is to boast, to be proud, to show off, to show your status. That is always the case. And if you truly don't want to boast and be proud, you should not wear expensive clothing. Number 2, not all can wear them. Some people are too poor to be able to buy expensive clothing. And especially when you make this a norm in your church, it becomes a huge problem. I met several people who explained that they cannot really identify with the pastor in church because the pastor has this expensive suit and a tie and all that. And that's a serious problem because, as James, the brother of Jesus, says, the kingdom of God is really for the poor. And so we should identify with them and thus leave expensive clothing behind. Number 3, speaking of the poor, expensive clothing kills them. This is what James speaks about in chapter 5 of his letter. He says that rich people will bring misery upon themselves because they live in luxury and because they kill the righteous one. Why? Well, when you spend money on expensive clothes and other unnecessary stuff, you don't use that money in saving the lives of the poor. And today, there are over 20,000 people that die from poverty every single day. There is so much misery and suffering due to the inequality in the world. And as Christians, we should fight against that by living as simple as we can and giving the rest of our money to the poor. Otherwise, we'll kill them. Furthermore, a lot of the clothes that are expensive, that are of this fashion style and that people wear on parties and so on, are produced in a manner that is really damaging to the poor, in sweatshops, in horrible conditions where child labor could be used and so on. This is obviously not something that we should support. Number 4, they're unnecessary. You don't need expensive clothing. Well, what about, if I'm invited to a wedding or a funeral, you may say, well, show up in a t-shirt. Nobody's going to kill you, hopefully. Or if you really feel that you have to, buy something very cheap at a second-hand store. But buying expensive clothing and following fashion really is not something you need. You can easily exchange that by another more simple lifestyle without damaging your relationship to God at all. Instead, your relationship with God will be even better. Number 5, they cause stress and anxiety. When you wear expensive clothing, you suddenly are aware that you don't get any stains and that the clothes aren't as damaged as the usual rags that you normally wear. And that's quite painful for no one else than you. If you don't wear expensive clothing, if you only wear cheap rags, you won't have to think about that and your life will get much easier. You can more easily focus on the kingdom of God instead. Number 6, the Bible never commands it. There is never ever a command in the Bible that says wear expensive clothing. On the contrary, Jesus pointed to the lilies as not laboring or working, but still God has created them beautifully, and that, dear brother or sister, is true for you as well. Now, didn't Jesus have expensive clothing? Some of you may think that is a modern myth. The seamless tunic that John talks about in chapter 19 of his gospel wasn't expensive at all. This is something that prosperity preachers made up in the 20th century, but there's no evidence that this was expensive. Rather, it sort of reminds us of a poncho, which is quite cheap piece of clothing today. And number 7, the Bible explicitly forbids wearing expensive clothing. 1 Peter 3 verse 3, for example, says, don't be concerned about the outward beauty of fancy hairstyles, expensive jewelry, or beautiful clothes. And this is a similar verse in 1 Timothy 2. Now, some people will say that's just cultural, that was just what was relevant in that time. But then we forget that the lifestyle that is consistently encouraged in the New Testament is a lifestyle of simplicity, where we don't choose to be rich, where we are content with the basics, food and clothing, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 6, and where we make sure that everybody have what they need. We really shouldn't strive for looking fancy and spending a lot of money on fashion and clothing. We should live as simple as possible, either wearing rags or a Eden suit. Thanks for watching.